Hello everyone, my name is Marne Titchenell. I am the Wildlife Program Specialist for the Ohio State University Extension. I work in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. So this is the time of year when Ohio's frogs and toads are very vocal. And because one of the easiest ways to identify frogs and toads is to learn their calls, I've put together this video to get you a little bit more familiar with some of the more commonly heard calls in Ohio. I hope you enjoy it. Notice that this is part 1. There will be a part 2 where we will review some of the less common frogs and toads in Ohio and talk a little bit more about conservation. All right, let's get started. Before we start listening to calls, let's talk briefly about the class Amphibia. There are a little over 8,000 species worldwide, and they belong to 3 major groups. The anurans are the frogs and toads, and they make up 88% of all amphibian species. There in the middle, we have the caecilians. They are tropical amphibians that specialize in burrowing. They have no legs and very small eyes. They comprise about 2.6% of all amphibian species. Thirdly, we have the salamanders, one of my favorite groups of animals. There are a little over 700 species of salamanders in the world, and here in Ohio we have 25 species, which is pretty diverse. But today we are here to talk about frogs and toads. In Ohio we have 15 species, and most can be easily identified by their mating calls. So when you hear frogs calling, it signals the beginning of their breeding season. Now, frogs use their vocal sacs, which you see inflated in the picture on the left, to resonate their calls. How does it work? Frogs will inflate their vocal sacs with air from their lungs. The call we hear is produced by a controlled rush of air through the larynx and across the frog's vocal cords. The resulting sound is then amplified by the vocal sac. Oftentimes, you will see a frog inflate its vocal sac with the first call, and if another call is forthcoming, the frog will continue to hold air in the sac until that next call. So you're going to see that happening in the video I took of a gray tree frog calling. So let's play that. Another fact about frogs and toads that makes identification a bit easier is that they begin calling at different times throughout the spring and summer. So depending on the time of year, you may only have a handful of frogs calling, making ID even easier. So the last question I want to answer before we listen to some of these frogs that you're looking at right here is, where do frogs breed? So let's remember our amphibian biology from school. Frogs and toads need water to lay their eggs. So the males and females head to their breeding sites before they start calling. What do these breeding sites look like? Well, certain species of frogs and toads prefer to breed in pools like this one. We call this a vernal pool or a vernal wetland. And they are particularly important as their ephemeral nature does not allow fish to survive, which are predators to tadpoles. Frogs and toads will also utilize ponds, lakes, streams, creeks and swamps, marshes, etc., even flooded fields as important breeding sites. This is a picture of the pond in my neighborhood, and every summer we get to enjoy bullfrogs and green frogs calling. So now that we know where and why Ohio frogs and toads call, let's start to learn who is calling. And I'm going to be going through these calls in order of when we would hear them, so starting at the early part of the year. So here is our first frog. So this is one of the first species of frogs you will hear calling, sometimes as early as February. They don't call for very long. Most of them are done by early April. So this is the wood frog. Wood frogs are Ohio's most terrestrial frog. They do prefer to breed in wet woodlands and vernal pools, but after that they spend most of their time on land. They overwinter on land beneath the leaf litter, surviving freezing temperatures due to their ability to become partially frozen and yet still survive. And wood frogs aren't the only Ohio frogs with this sci-fi ability. Spring peepers, chorus frogs, and tree frogs can do it too. Here is a short clip of wood frogs calling from a vernal pool in Mohican State Park. My husband was running there back in early March, and this pool was teeming with breeding wood frogs, and so he took a video for me. Okay, let's listen to our next frog. I think the call of that frog sounds a lot like a creaky rocking chair, but other folks have described it as sounding like you're dragging your fingernail down a comb. These are tiny little frogs, even when fully grown, measuring less than 2 inches. So if you haven't guessed it already, this is the western chorus frog. They begin calling in February, as early as February, until about mid-May, and so you may hear them calling right along with the wood frogs that we just listened to. Chorus frogs can be heard calling from woodland vernal pools and also pools in more open areas. Now, in parts of southern Ohio, there is also the mountain chorus frog, whose call is similar, but it's a little bit faster and higher pitched. We'll cover mountain chorus frogs in Who's Croaking Part 2. A distinguishing feature of the western chorus frog are the 3 distinctive dark stripes running from the nose all the way down the back. Western chorus frogs are a member of the Hylidae family, and another characteristic of this family are toe discs, which allow them to cling to surfaces really well. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So here's a great shot of a member of the Hylidae family clinging to a window, and you can really see those toe discs. Other members of the family Hylidae in Ohio are listed there. So the chorus frogs that we just talked about, gray tree frogs, spring peepers, and the cricket frog. With this frog that you're looking at, that bright yellow coloration on the inside of the thighs is an ID feature. I'm not going to tell you who this is yet. I'm not going to give it away, but we'll talk about him later. So let's listen to our next frog. So you are listening to a single frog. What you're going to hear next is a group of this species calling. And a little bit different call there at the end. So I think this frog is well named. Its name describes not only when you hear it, but what it sounds like. So this is the spring peeper. They have a very high-pitched peep, something that you might consider hearing more from a bird rather than a frog. Like the western chorus frogs, spring peepers are very small, making them possibly the loudest frog in Ohio for their size. We hear them calling early, once again, sometimes as early as mid-February, and they'll call through May. And this is another species that you may hear calling right along with chorus frogs and wood frogs. Spring peepers often call from vegetation above the water rather than in the water like the wood frogs we looked at earlier. This species looks very similar to the western chorus frog, but the markings on the back are a little bit different. Instead of those 3 vertical lines that we saw with the western chorus frog, you often see kind of an X shape on the back of our spring peepers. Let's take a listen to our next species. So there was a lot going on in that last clip, not only the frog, but did anybody else hear the birds calling in the background? There was a red-winged blackbird, and then after that, a woodpecker calling. So back to the frog. This frog is common throughout Ohio. You can find them calling and breeding in a wide variety of habitats, from ponds to streams to marshes and flooded fields. So this is the northern leopard frog, and I'm sure it's easy to tell where this frog gets its name, given its spots. You can hear them calling mid-March through May. They most often call from the water, sometimes even fully submerged. And during summer, they are often found in more open areas away from water, which has earned them nicknames like grass frog and meadow frog. And as you can see from this picture, in those types of environments, their spots work really well to conceal them. So we have one right here and right there. And here's our next species. So there were a few species calling in that last clip. Did anybody hear the spring peepers? What you most likely noticed was that very long call that almost seemed to go on forever. And that is the trill of the American toad. And sometimes those trills can last 20 to 30 seconds long. And if you have multiple toads calling at once, it can really seem ongoing. Toads start calling around the end of March through May. And they will breed in just about any water source, even a water-filled tire rut. Females lay these long strings of thousands of eggs, sometimes up to 12,000 eggs. And those eggs develop quickly. By early June, there are pea-sized toads everywhere. Now, there are some misconceptions surrounding toads. One is that they will give you warts. I'm here to say they do not give you warts, but they do pee in self-defense. So if you pick them up, you might get a handful of urine. Toads also secrete toxins from their skin, and while these toxins are not harmful to humans, along with the pee thing, it's definitely a good idea to wash your hands after handling a toad. Let's listen to another species. So once again, we had a second frog calling in the background of that last clip. Maybe you were able to identify it, but we're going to talk about it next, so I'm not going to give it away. The explosive prolonged trill belonged to the gray tree frog. This frog starts calling mid-April throughout July, and perhaps looking at that picture, you're noticing the yellow coloration in the inner thigh. We saw that back when we talked about frogs clinging to windows. So the gray tree frog is another member of the family Hylidae, and they have very well-developed toe discs, making them adept climbers and clingers. They prefer to call from above on logs, branches, trees, and other vegetation above the pools and ponds that they breed in. The rest of their time is spent up high in the trees. And another neat ability of gray tree frogs is that they are able to change colors depending on their surroundings. They can change from a light pearl gray to a darker gray to varying shades of green. And as you can see in this picture, this ability works really well to help them avoid detection from predators. And here is our next species. This frog is perhaps the most abundant and widespread frog in Ohio. This is the northern green frog. I think their call sounds like you're plucking a banjo string. These are also the frogs where if you walk around the edge of a pond, they give that little yip and jump into the water. You can hear them calling often from permanent bodies of water as they are very aquatic. They also prefer more permanent bodies of water to breed in because while some of the tadpoles will metamorphose the same year, others may overwinter and complete that metamorphosis in the next breeding season. So they need that permanent body of water to make sure their tadpoles survive. These frogs don't start calling until later in the summer, so you may not start to hear them until May, lasting into August. The northern green frog is easily confused with the bullfrog, but it's smaller and it has two very noticeable ridges along its back, and you won't see those on bullfrogs. So let's listen to our final species. I think most folks recognize the deep rumbling call of this frog. To me, it sounds like the bullfrogs are saying rum. Maybe they were pirates in another life. So light green frogs, bullfrogs are the last frogs to call in Ohio. Bullfrogs will call into July with their deep bass call, and they're the largest frog in Ohio. Their egg masses can be up to a foot wide. And because their tadpoles take 2 to 3 years to mature, they are also a very aquatic frog. They are found most often in permanent bodies of water like ponds, marshes, and slow-moving streams. Okay, so once again, here is our calendar of breeding activity for Ohio's frogs and toads. We started at the top with western chorus frogs and wood frogs, and we ended all the way down at the bottom with our green frogs and bullfrogs. I realize we did not cover all of the species, but stay tuned for part 2 of Who's Croaking, where we will talk about those other species. So hopefully you now have a good start towards learning your frog and toad calls. The best time to go out and conduct these acoustic surveys are warm nights with low wind speeds, anywhere from March through July. Be sure to also grab a flashlight if you feel like venturing a little bit closer to the water to catch a glimpse of these guys. I thought I would include a few things that landowners can do to provide habitat for frogs and toads. So first of all, recognize that vernal pools are incredibly important habitat and aim to protect those on your property or perhaps consider creating them. Create shallow edges around ponds, especially if predatory fish are in your ponds. Those shallow edges can provide some safe places for frogs and toads to call from, as well as lay their eggs. And anchor logs to banks over open water for turtles to bask. I know we're talking frogs and toads, and turtles are reptiles, but I thought I'd just throw that in there in case you're interested in providing some habitat for some of Ohio reptiles as well. Add rocks, logs along shores to create shelter for our amphibians, and introduce native plants to the edges of the ponds and to the water. So here are some examples of some native plants that you might consider adding to your pond. On the left side, the sedges, rushes, and the other plants I have listed there don't mind having their feet wet, so those are good ones for growing along the edges and then within the water to provide some good cover for frogs and toads while they're calling. And then on the right is a list of trees and shrubs that are also very wildlife friendly. Here are a few resources if you want to learn more. The first two are books packed with great info about Ohio's amphibians. Frog Watch USA is where you can go to listen to your frog and toad calls. AmphibiaWeb is an excellent up-to-date online resource. You can also listen to calls there as well. And the last one, definitely check that out if you are looking to manage your property for amphibians and reptiles. It's a really well done publication. Additionally, we do have a series of Ohio State University Extension pond management fact sheets, and they can be accessed on the Woodland Stewards website under the Publications tab. So thank you all so much. Again, my name was Marne Titchenell, and I hope you enjoyed learning more about Ohio's frogs and toads.